Usually when designing a fighting game roster, you'll notice that some characters' tools have similarities with another character's tools. Sometimes it can also go to the extreme where you have a full clone of a base character. And a good general rule of thumb when designing these kinds of characters are that the clone needs to have unique strength that covers a weakness of the base character, while sacrificing something in return. Sometimes things don't always go as according to plan though, and you can end up with character overlap where one counterpart is objectively stronger than the other, and completely outshines them in tournaments. For more modern fighting game titles, you don't get the same degree of character overlap that Scorpion and Human Smoke did in Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, but it can still happen. And there is no better example of character overlap that I can elaborate on better than Rice in pre-depowering Tough Love Arena. Rice didn't get a personality until the depowering patch, and until then Rice was generally regarded as a worse Noodle. For all the new players in Tough Love Arena, here is a refresher on what Rice used to be. Let me go over normals first. 5L didn't really change that much, but instead of canceling into Whip Splash, you got to cancel into Multi-Slap. It can be used to create space in your 5L block strings, or it can be used as an ender in your SWAT loops. On the surface, Whip doesn't look too different, but the changes are really subtle. It was -7 on block and it had 5 more recovery frames. This made it much more prone to it getting whiff punished, and it also was punishable on block. The one thing I can give it though is that the cancel window was much more longer. This allowed for you to be able to RC when you were minus. This was known as future sight. SWAT was a lot more different than it used to be. Imagine SWAT and swipe fused together. If the anti-air box didn't connect, it would transition into the swipe part of the move. Although you could cancel that transition from SWAT into swipe by pressing 5SL. This was known as SWAT cancel, and it's basically today's SWAT. There's not a lot I can say about teleport, but you have to keep in mind it's in a meta where every character's walk speeds were higher. This made it much easier to punish on reaction. So if Rice only has 2 different tools from Noodle pre-depowering, what makes Rice that much worse? Well first, I want to take a look at Rice's combo damage when they don't have meter. Admittedly, Rice's meter damage is actually pretty good. And there was one meterless setup ubiquitous to both carbs that did a lot of damage. These were called whip loops. And Rice could convert these whip loops into SWAT loops. Rice's only setup into whip loops was an anti-air 5L. But what if the opponent just didn't jump? What happens to Rice's combo routes then? As you can see, Rice's main form of meterless damage comes only from confirming off of 5H. It's really hard for Rice to break 300 meterless, like every other character can do. And don't even try using a jump in starter, because it scales your combo 2 times, and it even leaves you with less damage. Your other normal isn't doing you any favors either. 5L's maximum meterless route is 190, not counting the fact that you don't get a knockdown. And it'd be kind of fine if anti-air 5L was the only setup into whip loops, if Noodle didn't have their own meterless setup into it, with Close Fist. Rice was very reliant on meter for their combo damage, but it doesn't stop there. There are much more situations in which Rice was very meter hungry. Let's look at Rice's set of anti-airs for the moment. 5L has long active frames and it can set up whip loops, so it's pretty good damaging wise, but it loses to space jumps. So if you want a more consistent option, your next bet is SWAT, which is theoretically pretty good since it covers the size of Texas and has long-lasting air armor. But if you actually get the anti-air connect, this happens. You're exactly point blank right in the opponent's face. Every character can outbox you here. Your only option for keeping this kind of remotely safe is having to spend a bar for SWAT RC, which makes this only decent as an anti-air. I mean, that's this move's purpose, right? This also applies to SWAT as a combo ender, which is why you have to use Whip Splash. I already mentioned that Rice's meterless damage off of 5L is bad in your combos, but this also hurt a lot in your punish scenarios. Like I said, you only get 190 and no knockdown. But even when you had a bar of meter, you still had to contend with the other carb for better damage. Compare Noodle's 1 bar conversion off a 5L punish with Rice's. Let's take a step back from meter requirements at the moment. If Rice's damage was locked behind an anti-air or a meter requirement, maybe Rice has meterless strings somewhere else, like pressuring the opponent's wake-up? Unsurprisingly, Rice had the worst Oki in the roster. But further elaborating on this subject, joining me for this segment is fellow Tough Love Arena content creator Puzzlebox. I'm going to be taking a back seat for this segment, so take it away, Puzzlebox.
Rice had very bad Oki. One reason for this is that Rice did not have access to a safe jump after Rice's knockdown. Most other characters had a safe jump off of a hard knockdown. Characters like Beef and Onion had good knockdown pressure with a free safe jump. The only real option Rice had was to go for a meaty whip. While it was safe, it didn't do any chip damage, and it didn't threaten any kind of a mix-up. Even Rice's counterpart, Noodle, had a meaty fist setup, which was guaranteed chip damage, and there wasn't a reversal that actually beat fist. Rice isn't even able to use SWAT after a hard knockdown, because Rice can't get into range after a hard knockdown. So in general, Rice had awful Oki in early builds of the game.
You might be saying to your screen right now, but Ellington, Rice doesn't need great offensive options, they're a naturally defensive character. What if I told you they struggled there too? Here's the part of the video where I get the elephant out of the room. Teleport was the worst reversal by far. It was impossible to use against carbs, very hard to use against spices, and okay to use against meats, but you ran the risk of eating a lemon loop or a chop loop. And it got even harder to use against cross-ups. Unironically, I think your best defensive option was just using burst, and this also tied into why Rice was very meter hungry. You used burst and you lost your coverage to your meterless weaknesses, but you try to cover your meterless weaknesses and you lose burst. What gives? Having a lack of a reversal hurt Rice not only against pressure, but also against RPS mix-ups. On that note, let's talk about Rice's mix-ups for a second. As you can imagine, Rice's mix-ups were pretty awful. Even on a right read, Rice's returns were so little. 190 on jab with no knockdown, and 200 on throw. And this is more of a pet peeve of mine than anything, but Rice didn't get a standing tick throw after jab. Most characters could just backwalk out of this mix-up and Rice would just lose pressure. Noodle had about the same weaknesses when it came to these mix-ups, but at least Noodle had Frenzy to cover strike. And when neither carb had meter, the differences in their mix-ups became a lot more absurd. Rice got complemented by a bit more damage and a knockdown of a 5L, but Noodle got a close fist conversion off of both 5L and Frenzy. The opponent's win condition on Rice was to make their way past 5H and SWAT, and when that happened, Rice sucked at dealing with up-close pressure and had no good reversal to back it up. Rice's defense was pretty awful. This last point I'm going to bring up is pretty abstract, but it's a good talking point in how Rice played neutral. Rice's biggest weakness, in my opinion, was a lack of a tool that didn't even exist yet. One thing that I can credit to Rice is that their neutral wasn't terrible, but you can definitely see where they started to struggle. Their main neutral play was with 5H, and sometimes they can sneak into future sight. But again, for Rice being so meter hungry, it held its risk. Also, because of 5H having worse block safety and all walk speeds were higher, it was much more easy to micro-walk in on. Whip zoning was a lot less threatening than now. The best thing akin to swipe was swat, but even then it was worse on a lot of metrics. It was +1 on hit and -7 on block. The returns on hit were so mediocre since there was no possible link from it and you can't RC it. I'm not even kidding when I say that's the best you get from it. That's why most players just use it as a chipping tool and mix it up with SWAT cancels, but in both cases it was pretty easy to challenge. There was one block string into it with 5 HHS, but it was very fake unless you spaced it, and even then, it was an 8-frame gap, so if Spice's buffered sweep, spacing it didn't work at all. I remember this anecdote in particular from the Grum that says if you just walk forward versus SWAT, the best Rice can hope for is being +1 and taking 100 damage, but Rice had positioning disadvantage, which was overall worse. Having a life lead on Rice made this super consistent of an anti-SWAT option. Rice had to resort to using 5H here. Having the risky neutral option of SWAT, as well as the easier counterplay of Whip, made Rice's neutral very volatile. Compared to New Rice, which because of the addition of Swipe, solves about every single issue I've talked about in this segment, even with some added benefits like meaty swipe after knockdowns and having a better way to counter reversals. Alright, here's my brief synopsis. This is me switching from factual analysis Ellington to real talk Ellington. This is mostly just my opinion. I'll give Rice the benefit of the doubt here, because if I'm being honest, every character's neutral wasn't great either. Noodle's was only better by a tiny amount, but nothing significant. It was only when characters actually won neutral where they really got to shine, such as Onion getting a whiff punish, Pork getting an approach, and Garlic getting a knockdown. I think this was in part why Rice couldn't keep up with the meta. Rice's neutral wins were too meaningful without meter, and their neutral losses really hurt. Rice was unequipped for dealing with the meta in comparison to Noodle, who had good walling to stuff approaches and a great tool to set up whip loops. It's funny how a character that is meant to be great in neutral fits perfectly in a footsie-based fighting game. But pre-depowering was not as much footsie-based as it was vortex-based. So if Noodle outclassed Rice in consistent damage, neutral, Oki, up-close mix-up, defense, and consistent anti-airs, was there anything that Rice was better at than Noodle? Actually? Yeah. For one, Rice actually got better reward off of 5H than Noodle. Noodle typically conserved meter for their 5H conversions, but when Rice had it, Rice also had the threat of SWAT loops in their back pocket, which made Whip a bit scarier of a poke to go against, and that was great for it being easy to hit confirm and counterpoke with. Rice's access to SWAT loops also meant they had higher damage conversions than Noodle. While Noodle had consistent damage, Rice's instantaneous damage broke 600, and they were actually better at making comebacks than Noodle. And even though it was locked behind an anti-air, that's still really good on a character that makes you want to jump in neutral. 600 is on par with the Meats and Onion damage, and unlike them, Rice's max damage ender wasn't even corner locked. Another thing was that Rice had a bit better instantaneous space coverage. I talk a lot about how SWAT is generally very committal, but it can also be good at stuffing certain approaches. Without SWAT, Hopkick becomes a lot more abusable in the matchup. Some Rices actually chose to just SWAT cancel a neutral despite the commitment, just so that they can stuff certain approaches from meat jump-ins and hop-kicks. You'll actually see this a lot in old pre-depowering sets with Meat vs. Waddle and Meat vs. Busy Dawn. New Rice absolutely is a huge improvement on the character. What weaknesses did stick over Tough Love Arena's lifespan was his character design choices that fit the zoner archetype that the carbs adhere to. I just thought pre-depowering Rice was an interesting case study in character overlap and how that affects a character's viability. It was a mistake, but an important mistake that we can all learn from, and in the end, Tough Love Arena was no less fun of a game then. I'd like to thank Paul, the head dev of Tough Love Arena, for giving me special access to the pre-depowering patch. Labbing for this vid and gathering footage could not have been possible without his contribution. I'd also like to thank Puzzlebox, who I've been meaning to collaborate with for a long time, and who also has great knowledge on pre-depowering Tough Love Arena. I hope you enjoyed the vid. You can subscribe to the channel for more Tough Love Arena content, and if you felt I left anything out, feel free to let us all know in the comments. This is Ellington Reborn signing out. Peace.